One of the things that I found interesting was how you talked about a tactic of the People's Law Office was kind of get postponements and put cases off. And it just reminded me of my own situation with Dennis. This thing took years and years. We kept getting different venue changes and different people, different judges. Jeff, tell us a little bit about what you remember and what you report in your book of the night of December 4th.
Well, I'm going to go back here and just a moment.
Because you talk a little bit about Skip Andrews, and one of the things that I want to ask you will be kind of Skip's great insight to have Mike Gray and Howard Alk, these filmmakers who made the movie The Murder of Fred Hampton, to actually film the assassination site. So tell us about that night, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you guys put it together and really won a great victory on one level.
Well, on December 2nd, I had gone over to the Panther office, and I had worked with Fred because the Panthers had raised the money to buy their office on Madison. They wanted to buy it because the police, there had been 3 or 4 attacks on the office by the police, and needless to say, the landlord was not pleased. So the only way they had any security is if they could buy that building. At that time, it was costing $6,000. So they had the money, and so I went over there and met and talked with Fred about signing the papers. And I walked in, and here was this young man. He was in a T-shirt. It was December, but it was warm in the office. And I went there, and Fred I'm talking to him, and while I'm talking to him, he's giving orders to people. Show up for the breakfast program on time. Make sure we have the cereal there. Come to political education classes on Monday and Wednesday. Get your share of newspapers. It was like a staccato. It was like a modern rapper talking, and the energy of this young man, and people with bouncing questions off of him, and he was talking to me and talking to them. But there was a warmth and a love around everything he did. He loved people, and people loved him. And I felt, and I wrote at the time, that sort of the energy, the Panthers worked a lot off of Fred's energy. This was December 2nd, a Tuesday, and I had to put together this housing proposal for this coalition that had been set up with the Panthers and the Young Lords and Rising Up Angry and the Young Patriots. So I did that all day Wednesday, and I was up all night typing it, or had somebody else type it. It was the days when you type something, you had whiteout, and you had to go through, and if you wanted to add a paragraph, you had to retype the entire thing, and some people remember that pretty well. Yeah. And, so I was up all night Wednesday night with somebody else typing it, and got home about 6 o'clock in the morning on December 4th. And I'd just fallen asleep when I heard a loud knock at the front door. Dazed, I got up and opened it. My partner, Skip Andrew, was standing there dressed in suit and tie. Chairman Fred is dead. I just got a call from Rush. The pigs vamped on the chairman's crib this morning. I remained stuck on the words, Chairman Fred is dead. Someone else was killed, and a lot of people were shot, Skip said. Deborah Johnson and some others are at the Wood Street Police Station. The people wounded are at Cook County Hospital. What should I do, I asked. Skip said, I'm meeting Rush at the morgue, and then we're going to the chairman's crib. Why don't you go to Wood Street and try to talk to some of the survivors? Sure, I stammered. He turned abruptly and was gone down the steps. I replayed Skip's words in my mind, the chairman is dead. It was Fred who made us believe we were strong and unstoppable. Now he was dead. That's how my morning of December 4th started. It's 3 hours later, and I was in the Wood Street station. I went down there to interview the survivors. And Henry had an order that nobody could get in. They weren't supposed to speak to anybody because he was going to hold a press conference and give the police version of what happened in this raid. And so I went down, and first I was turned away, and then I went down and filed this housing proposal. I came back and I read a statute that said it's a criminal it's a criminal violation to prevent any lawyer from interfering with the client. So I called Hanrahan's office and they let me in. Finally, they said, "You can get in." There was a knock at the door. The patrolman unlocked it, and Deborah Johnson was brought into the cramped room. This was our first meeting. She leaned over, crying and shaking, supporting herself. Now, Deborah Johnson was the fiancée of Fred Hampton. She was 8 months pregnant with his son, who was born posthumously. This was our first meeting. She leaned over, crying and shaking, supporting herself with one hand on the table. Slowly, she sat down. She looked at me guardedly, not quite fathoming who I was or why I was there. "I'm Jeff Haas with the People's Law Office." The mention of my PLO connection and my afro appeared to relax her a little. "How are you and your baby?" There was a pause as if she didn't hear me. Then she responded, "I wasn't shot like a lot of the others. The pigs pushed me around, but I think my baby is okay." Fred never really woke up. We were sleeping. I woke up hearing shots from the front and back. I shook Fred, but he didn't open his eyes. Deborah demonstrated how she had pushed Fred against Fred several times, trying to wake him. At one point, he sort of raised up and then lay back down again. She repeated that he never opened his eyes. I got on top of him to try to protect him from the gunshots. The bed was shaking from the bullets. She said the shooting stopped only after someone in the room with her yelled, "We got a pregnant sister in here." She told me 2 pigs came into the bedroom. One of them pulled up her nightgown and called out, "Look, we got a broad here." Then they pulled her out into the kitchen. Deborah stopped talking as she wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her nightgown. I was nodding my head, trying to be supportive. "Fred never really woke up," she repeated. "He was lying there when they pulled me out of the bedroom." She paused. Then she described 2 police officers going into their bedroom, hearing one of them fire 2 shots, followed by, "He's good and dead now." Deborah put her head down. A moment later, she raised it suddenly and looked at me. "What can you do?" she asked. Indeed, what could I do about the horrible murder she had just described? While that was my introduction to what happened that morning, Skip Andrew, who had woken me up because he lived down the street, met Rush first at the morgue where they identified Fred's body, and then they went to the apartment. But they called Mike Gray, a filmmaker who was making a documentary on Fred Hampton, and they called a minister, Reverend Reed, to meet them at the apartment that morning. And I've never understood, we were so either confused or angry or upset. Skip had the presence of mind to bring a filmmaker and a minister so that he could gather evidence on tape. And that's one of the reasons that film is so compelling. You actually see the apartment as they walk in, and you see Skip pick up, and there was a door lying there right outside of Fred's bedroom, and you see him pick up a bloody poster and say, look at the camera and say, "This is where the chairman must have died." And it's in the film, and it was a spontaneous remark. And so Skip and my partner Flint and everybody from the People's Law Office spent the next 3 or 4 days gathering the evidence because the police never sealed the apartment. And so Hanrahan goes on TV that morning and says the police were serving a search warrant, and surprisingly, the Panthers opened fire on them and kept firing at them. And they made it look like this was just an ordinary search warrant, and they were surprised. Of course, they took a .45 caliber machine gun, a rifle, handguns, and shotguns on this raid. So they weren't trying to take an unregistered weapon away from a grandmother. They pretty much knew what they were going to do out there. I think it was the only raid that they ever took a .45 caliber machine gun on that they had ever remembered. So Hanrahan was on TV, and one of the things he said is, and Fred Hampton was firing at the police as they came in the back door. And we found him dead on the bed, and his hand was right next to this .45 from which he fired these shots. And Hanrahan went on further and gave an interview with the Tribune a few days later, and he said, and he showed a photograph of the back door with 2 black dots and says, "Here's the proof that Fred Hampton fired." And he gives it to the Tribune, it's front page news. The other papers, competitively, we said, "Come on out here and we'll show you those bullet holes." So they came out to the apartment, and those bullet holes were in fact nail heads. And so the next day they confronted Hanrahan, and he had no answer. He said, "I made no representation about those photographs." And another person asked him, "Are you going to resign, Mr. Hanrahan?" And he looked around indignantly and said, "Are there any serious questions?" In fact, that question was somewhat prescient because Hanrahan's political career, as he later stated, ended on December 4th at 2337 West Monroe.